All right. Good evening. Listen, just for the record, I want you to know that I wore the ugliest shirt I own tonight just to make sure that nobody else had a matching shirt. I told my wife I'll never be able to wear that shirt to church again because somebody out of the 70 other men that have it will wear it on that day. So we'll see. Open your Bibles to the book of Proverbs. We are looking this summer at the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, the opening section of the book that is primarily collected by Solomon, widely recognized as the wisest man in the ancient world. He had a heartbeat, if you will, for Proverbs. It's something that he inherited, because we're going to see in some of the verses we look at tonight that this passion for wisdom came to Solomon from his father David. David was the grandest king in the history of Israel. He was the king of Israel's golden age, if you will. And Solomon followed in that sense of recognizing that wisdom was the key to his father's success. In other words, it wasn't just military might, it wasn't just personal charisma, it was the ability to take the facts surrounding him, put them in order by understanding that came to him from the Spirit of God, and then to act in a wise fashion on the basis of what he knew and understood. Solomon learned that. He was not as successful then passing that passion for wisdom on to his son. We'll see that in these verses as well. In Proverbs chapters 2, 3, and 4, we have a section that I've called the rewards of wisdom. And we went through chapter 3, verse 12 a week ago. And so I want to pick up with chapter 3, verse 13. And we'll see if we can get through chapter 4. We do not meet next Wednesday night. Next week is Vacation Bible School, and so the campus will be a bit chaotic through the week. We have, I asked the staff to give me the numbers, and we have over 200 elementary age children enrolled in Vacation Bible School. About half of them are evergreen families, and about half of them are non-evergreen families. We have over 125 adult workers for Vacation Bible School. Then we have boot camp for our 6th graders and the adult workers that go with that. And then we have about 30 preschoolers and the adult workers that go with that. And so the total next week for Vacation Bible School, there will be something in the neighborhood of 400 people on our campus doing Bible school. It's going to be a lot of fun because Tuesday is a voting day and we're a precinct. So we'll see how that goes. But we won't meet on Wednesday evening. This is the 4th Wednesday of the summer. We'll take 1 week off, and then we'll have 4 more Wednesdays, and we'll wrap up summer programming. So we're going to try and finish the 4th chapter of Proverbs this evening, and I started the series with an introduction to the entire book. So it's almost like 5 lessons that I squeezed into 4 weeks, and then we'll come back and we'll have 5 chapters of Proverbs to squeeze into the last 4 weeks. So it's all very symmetrical. Proverbs chapter 3, picking up where we left off, we saw 2 major temptations. We saw the evil man who tempts you to pursue criminal behavior, who tempts you to pursue violence. We saw the evil woman who tempts you to lust, to easy sex. The man offers easy money. The woman offers easy sex. Parental appeals are the mark of these chapters. Each new section basically begins with the phrase, "my son." It is the presentation of a father intentionally passing wisdom on to his son. It's not And this is probably the very first lesson we need to grasp onto from the book of Proverbs for our generation. It is not professional teachers. It is not pastors. It is certainly not government officials who are charged with the responsibility of raising up wise adults from the next generation. It is parents. They have a profound responsibility, and God gives them a unique opportunity to do just that. And yet, by and large, that has been abdicated in so many ways in our generation. Children have been handed off. The government has been quick to offer everything from K through 12 to then K4 and now K3. Why don't we just hand them over when we birth them in the hospital? Don't think that that's not on the agenda. There is an urgency here for parents to learn how to provide an inheritance that's worth passing it along. But there is the responsibility for that inheritance to be received. Solomon seems to have received it well from his father David. But if Solomon was as diligent as David in passing it along, something went wrong because his son Rehoboam does not display wisdom. You can find that story in the Kings, the books of Kings, and you will see that Rehoboam, as he ascended the throne after Solomon's death, he not only immediately made bad decisions, but he did it in the face of competent and wise counselors who told him to go in a different direction. Wisdom is precious. It provides tremendous benefits. But we saw from the very beginning of the book, it is something that you have to set your mind to pursue. It will not mug you in an alleyway and overwhelm you and make you wise. It is something you have to set your heart on and chase after in order to become a man or a woman of wisdom. Beginning in chapter 3, verse 13, I've called it praise for wisdom, but actually this is probably an ancient hymn that was included right here because it seemed to fit so well. Verses 13 through 20 of chapter 3 is a hymn. Blessed is a person who finds wisdom and one who obtains understanding. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her produce better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are those who hold on to her. The Lord founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. By his knowledge the ocean depths were burst open, and the clouds drip with dew. Let's talk about this. He starts by saying wisdom gives you a better return than money. In fact, it is the most exquisite form of wealth. Verse 15, her profit is better than the profit of silver, her produce better than gold, more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Now this is high, this is recognition that wisdom really is something out of the ordinary. We have a saying in our day, and we sort of jokingly say it, but it's true. We say common sense is not common. Well, our slang term, common sense, is the biblical phrase wisdom. It is the practical application of what we know so that we live a better life. The problem with money, you can buy a lot of things with money, but money not only doesn't make you smarter, it often reveals how stupid you are. It doesn't make you wiser. It often puts on display how senseless you really are. It doesn't make you happier. It often displays only that you chase after happiness in what the writer of Ecclesiastes, also Solomon, said was a vanity of all vanities, a waste of time to chase happiness with money like trying to grasp the mist of boiling water. Well, wisdom will get you further down the road. Verse 16, long life is in her right hand, in her left hand are riches and honor. In other words, the bounty of goodness in both the hands of wisdom. Wisdom is personified. It's often painted as a female. And she offers you goodness. We chase after long life. And yet here it says, wisdom is really the path to that. We chase after riches and honor. But biblically speaking, wisdom is the path to that as well. Verse 17 says, wisdom is the way that we come to a promise of a good life. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. The best part of this is in verses 18 through 20. The hymn takes on a tone, it talks about creation. Okay? Think about it this way. Listen to these verses again. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are those who hold on to her. The Lord founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. By his knowledge, the ocean depths were burst open. There's those three words that we keep talking about: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. In other words, what the hymn is telling us is that the very structure of the created order is established by God with marks of God's own knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. So in effect, when we don't chase after wisdom, we're effectively running counter to the very fabric of the whole universe. This is the key. Now, you might say, okay, we've been at this for 4 weeks, and the message has basically been the same every Wednesday night. Yeah, this is that old story about the preacher who preached the same sermon every Sunday. His deacons finally came to him and said, "Pastor, come on, you're killing us. Same sermon every Sunday. When are you going to change?" He said, "I'm going to change sermons as soon as you learn the one I'm preaching now." See, that's the point of Proverbs. I told you, Proverbs is a collection of sayings that have been distilled. They've been sort of boiled down to their essence. We're trying to cover big sections because I'm trying to expose you to the line of thought here. But the reality is, Proverbs is not meant to be eaten in huge doses. It's meant to be snacked on a little bit each day. It's meant to be chewed on, to be pondered. That's why at most a chapter a day, and frankly, maybe just one section or paragraph a day would be even better. Because it all has the same message from start to finish. And that message is, there's a better way. There's a way that's built into the very fabric of creation. There's a way that is a reflection of how God operates in the cosmos. There is a way that is designed by God intentionally to be handed from father and mother to son and daughter, generation after generation after generation. It is the way of wisdom. That's what this hymn says, the praise for wisdom. Now, what I like about Proverbs is, while it praises wisdom over and over in literally hundreds of different word pictures, I like when it gets very specific. In verse 27, we're going to see what I've called prohibitions against infidelity. And beginning in verse 31, prohibition against crime. Speaking about wisdom, he now brings some common scenarios to consider. And he says, okay, I've been telling you what wisdom is. I've been telling you what wisdom does. I've been telling you what wisdom provides you. Let me give you some examples of what not to do. Verse 27. Oh, wait a minute. I skipped one, didn't I? Oh, no, I didn't. I included the parental appeals, 21 through 26. I did that when we did the first 4 verses. Let's go to verse 27. Prohibitions against infidelity. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it to you, when you have it with you. Do not devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. Do not contend with a person for no reason if he has done you no harm. Now it's interesting, in verses 27 and 28, he's basically, this is the message: don't fail to do good when you have the ability to do good. When there is good that you have in your power to do for somebody, then do it. When your neighbor asks something of you that you can accomplish for them, do it. Don't ponder it. Don't weigh it or consider it. If you have what it takes to do something good, when good is called for, then do it. It is not, doing good is never somebody else's job. If you're the one on the scene, if God crosses your path with a need or an opportunity, and you have the capability to meet the need or to seize the opportunity, do it. Do not fail to do good. But now in verse 29 and 30, it's the opposite. Do not choose to do bad. Verse 29, don't devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. Don't contend with a person for no reason if he's done you no harm. In other words, don't commit schemes that are unprovoked against other people. The Bible has several examples of this. A couple come to mind. If you go to 1 Kings chapter 21, you have the story of Ahab, who wants the vineyard of his neighbor next to the palace. But his neighbor doesn't want to sell. So his wife, the queen, whose name symbolizes the worst of femininity in the entire Bible, her name was Jezebel. Interesting, you probably don't have any grandkids or cousins named Jezebel. That name's kind of fallen out of favor because she's the worst. Jezebel plots an unprovoked scheme against Naboth the neighbor and means to do him unnecessary harm so that the king and queen can get what they want when they've already been rebuffed. Well, you don't have to, you can read that story for yourself. Suffice it to say that Elijah the prophet prophesies against that royal couple, and Jezebel dies in the city, and according to the word of Elijah that came true, the dogs licked her blood in the streets. Now, that's kind of gross. Yeah, it is, but don't you think the lesson here is what goes around comes around? In the book of Esther, we have the story of Haman, who plots against Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's uncle, and she speaks to the king on behalf of Mordecai and the Jewish people. And Haman, who was an advisor to the king, who thought that he could eliminate everyone that he didn't like, everyone that he hated, he plots against the Jews only for it to turn back on him, and the king puts Haman and his execution in the public square. These are illustrations of the principle of wisdom. Don't fail to do good when it's in your ability to do good. Don't fail to meet a need when it's in your capability to meet a need. But likewise, don't choose to be bad. Don't instigate problems. Don't invent ways to be at odds with people. That's not the way of wisdom. Well, a prohibition against crime, beginning verse 31. Do not envy a violent person, and do not choose any of his ways. For the devious are an abomination to the Lord, but he is intimate with the upright. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. Though he scoffs at the scoffers, yet he gives grace to the needy. The wise will inherit honor, but fools increase dishonor. This is a great way to finish out this chapter, because the writer tells us that Yahweh himself is personally involved in opposing the unwise and in showing favor or blessing to the wise. In the ancient world, outside of Israel, but particularly later on when we have, by the time we get to the Greek and Roman eras, and somewhat even in the Persian period before that, one of the foundational principles of human philosophy was that life is sort of dictated by fate. Now, different cultures had different names for it. Sometimes it was personified as a god. Sometimes fate was a kind of nameless force. And it's not just in the Judeo-Christian era. Hinduism has the concept of karma. It's the idea that you know, you do the best you can, but at the end of the day, your life is pretty much determined by forces outside of your control. I mean, there's really not much you can do. You just kind of get what you get. Even within Islam, even though Islam considers itself to be a monotheistic religion, the God of Islam, called Allah, is very capricious and arbitrary. You never know what you're going to get from one day to another. I mean, when the Bible says about Jesus in the book of Hebrews that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, recognizing that Jesus is interchangeable with God when speaking about the nature or the characteristics of God, what the Bible is saying is not that God has no movement in his character. I mean, it's not that God is an impersonal force. He's a real person. He has real interactions with human beings. But what the verse means is that he never changes, in the sense that you know what you get. He's always consistent. What God hated in the Old Testament, he hated in the New Testament, he hates in the church era, and he will hate in the last days. You don't have to sort of figure out what his mood is from day to day. He's consistent. And because he's consistent, we can trust not only that he's trustworthy, but we can trust that we can actually know him and be in a relationship with him. He's not bipolar. He's steady. He's consistent. His nature is dependable. But the world has lived for many generations in many cultures with this idea that, you know, you get what you get. You know, fate comes along and sweeps you up and takes you, and it's kind of a despairing, deterministic attitude. Proverbs doesn't hold to that at all. He says, do not envy a violent person, and do not choose any of his ways. Why not? I mean, in our culture, don't the crooks seem to win the day most of the time? I mean, don't they seem to get away with stuff? Why wouldn't we follow that kind of way? It seems to be a shortcut to success. Well, here's why. For the devious are an abomination to the Lord. He sets himself against them. But he is intimate with the upright. Well, what's your priority? Worldly power and fame and celebrity and wealth, or intimacy with God that will last in eternity? You see, from our from the worldly perspective of our culture, those two things don't seem to weigh out. I mean, intimacy with God, isn't that kind of a pie in the sky? Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I mean, but my 15 minutes of fame, I could go on a television reality series and people would recognize me when I go out to dinner. I'd be famous. I'll make some money. I'll have a name. I'll get my own website. I might have a blog that people will follow. Now that's living. Well, see, here's where wisdom comes in. Because here's intimacy with God, and here's everything else the world has to offer. And wisdom is the only way to properly assess the two options and make the correct choice. I think even those of us who are believers, who are followers of Jesus, making that decision between what the world has to offer and the promises of being in the presence of God in eternity, it's still kind of a matter of faith for us. Because I'm pretty convinced that even on our best day, even on those rare moments in our lifetime when we've had what we call mountaintop experiences, even on our best day, we can't really even imagine what unhindered intimacy with God looks like. Wisdom says, trust the promise. Why? Because the wise thing to do is to trust the promise of the one who took that promise of wisdom and used it in the very construction of the whole universe in which we live. But you only get there with wisdom. Verse 33, the curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. Now, here's a great... Oh, by the way, if you want to memorize a verse in this chapter, it probably ought to be verse 32. That would be my recommendation. For the devious are an abomination to the Lord, but he is intimate with the upright. Listen, if you'd memorize that verse, if you would keep that verse in your head where the Spirit can call it up anytime you're faced with a choice, learning that verse will get you down the road to wisdom, even if you don't memorize anything else in the book of Proverbs. There's your motivation. But we've said this, I love these closing verses about Yahweh's response here. This idea that life is not driven by impersonal fate, but it is moved forward by a God who is intimately involved with us at a personal level. Though he scoffs at the scoffers, yet he gives grace to the needy. I watched a little bit of a debate this week online, and the anti-Christianity side of the debate could best be described as a scoffer. I mean, the whole idea was sort of humorous to him, that there is an invisible grandfather who sits in his rocking chair up in heaven and sort of throws down goodies to those people who bow down to him and pray imaginary prayers. I mean, he used that kind of language, and I was like, I thought to myself, because I've been reading these verses, I thought, I bet if we get real still and quiet right now, we could actually hear God scoffing at the scoffer. The imaginary grandfather in his rocking chair up in the sky. Listen, when we stand before God, I don't know everything that's going to look like, but I promise you it will not look like your grandfather in a rocking chair. every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Some by virtue of testimony of what God has done in their lives, others by virtue of the conquest of righteousness over wickedness. He scoffs at the scoffers. Yet, see, all these verses have buts or yets in them. Yet, he gives grace. To who? To the people who need grace. To the people who rely on him. To the people who aren't bound by blind fate, but actually trusting God to be who he said he was. The wise will inherit honor, but fools increase dishonor. Well, let's go to chapter 4. These benefits continue. In the first 9 verses, I've called it the generational priority of wisdom. That is, this is where Solomon really focuses in and highlights on the intentional transmission of wisdom from father to son. Listen, my sons, to the instruction of a father, and pay attention so that you may gain understanding. For I give you good teaching. Do not abandon my instruction. I love verse 3. When I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart take hold of my words, keep my commandments, and live. Now, a couple of interesting things about that. There's a very affectionate tone in those 4 verses. Solomon pauses as he's teaching his son. He pauses and remembers what it was like when he wasn't the father teaching wisdom, but he was instead the son learning wisdom from his father. It's interesting. His father was David, but he says, I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the sight of my mother. Now, Solomon had older brothers, but they were older half-brothers. When he uses this language, I think he's suggesting a true statement. He was the only son of his mother, Bathsheba. He remembers fondly. I mean, you can almost imagine the pause in this conversation with his son, where he looks up and he says, I remember when my father was teaching me, when my mother saw me as a special gift that God had put into her hands. My father taught me, and this is what he said. Now Solomon is talking to Rehoboam, but he's quoting David. Let your heart take hold of my words, keep my commandments, and live. Now, those words came to Solomon from David, his father, but ultimately, even from David, these are the words from God. Let your heart take hold of my words, not David's words, but the words David was teaching, God's words. Keep my commandments and live. In verse 5, another great verse, we have, in English, you see exclamation marks. Now, there's no grammar. There's no punctuation in Old Testament Hebrew. So you have to sort of capture emphasis by the structure of the sentence. You have to sort of imagine tone by the flow of the message. You've just had these 4 verses that have a kind of affectionate tone to them. And it's like he's been looking up and he's emphasizing, take these words that came to me from my father, but really came from God. Let them into your heart. Grasp hold of them, because that's where life can be found. And then he comes up with a kind of a passionate statement in verse 5. He has 2 positive verbs and 2 negative verbs here. Acquire wisdom. Acquire understanding. Do not forget, nor turn away from the words of my mouth. There's a kind of a major emphasis there. You can almost hear the affectionate tone turning into a note of urgency. Son, this is critical. Acquire it. Chase after it. Don't forget what I teach you. Don't turn away from the words that are coming out of my mouth. Speaking about wisdom, he says, do not abandon her, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is, and this is kind of in Hebrew, it's just as awkward in Hebrew as it is here in English. The beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom. And with all your possessions, acquire understanding. Now, verse 7 is really, it's a little bit unusual. The beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom. That's like saying, the way to make ice cream is go get some ice cream. The beginning of wisdom, what he really means here is, if you want to be a wise man, chase down wisdom. Acquire it. Get your hands on it. Don't ever let it go. In fact, whatever possessions you have to use to acquire it, it's worth the price. Verse 8, another little bit of a strange proverb. So many proverbs are written in a way that they parallel. In fact, they use different words, but the words are essentially the same thing, just a different vocabulary. Not verse 8. Verse 8 uses very different words that are not parallel terms, and it makes it a little fuzzy in the Hebrew. It's translated here, prize her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. Now, honor and exalt, those are relatively parallel terms, but prize her and embrace her are very different words in the Hebrew. So what he's saying here is there are two things. Show her value. Make wisdom a priority, and then go get it and hold on to it with everything that you have. Verse 9, she will place on your head a garland of grace. She will present you with a crown of beauty. There is an image here of athletic achievement, of victory, that idea of a garland of grace or a crown of beauty. It's the image of what an athlete in athletic competition would be awarded, kind of like our gold and silver and bronze medals. Listen. This is where he moves. See, listen, my son. Every time you see my son, we're starting in Hebrew, we're starting a new paragraph. And so we're going to go from this generational priority, this parenthesis that is chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, where he basically stops to re-emphasize to the young boy, listen up. This is, you have to know this. I had a son. There were a lot of times in conversations where we were talking about something and you interrupt the information that you're passing and you say, now wait a minute, look at me. Are you getting this? Are you hearing me? Are you paying attention? That's what chapter 4, verses 1 through 9 are. That's that interruption to make sure that Rehoboam is still tracking. Okay? Now, beginning in verse 10, we have a new paragraph, and it's going to be what I've called the beneficial pathway of morality. That is, the theme that we saw in chapters 2 and 3, this idea, particularly in chapter 2, this idea of two tempters that are offering other paths that you could choose. We're going to come back to that. Verse 10, it starts by saying, listen, my son. Now, in verse 1, we have that. It was in the plural, but I don't think there's any real significance there. But he said, listen, my sons. In verse 10, he says, listen, my son. In verse 20, the next time we come to a new paragraph, he says, my son, pay attention to my words. Listen, pay attention. What's interesting here is this is the Hebrew word that shows up in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which is, from the perspective of Israel, the most important verse in the entire Old Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, anybody know what that's called? The Shema. It says in this chapter, I want to look it up so I read it just exactly right. This is the verse that was quoted by faithful Jews every single day. This is a verse that often adorned their homes. Chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, or listen, Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's the basic foundational confession of faith that underlies everything in Judaism. The Lord our God is one God. That is everything that we've just been saying. He's consistent, He's faithful, He's trustworthy, there's no split personality, He's not schizophrenic, He's not bipolar. He is trustworthy. He is who He is. I am who I am. This is the same word. There's no accident here that in Proverbs we use that word because in the mind of a good Jewish student of the Torah, they would have understood anytime this word shows up, it means, ooh, you better catch this next part. It's foundational. Listen, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have instructed you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in upright paths. When you walk, your steps will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. Now, here's what's cool about verse 12. Verse 12 is another one of the verses in this section that I really like, because I think sometimes the Old Testament is not obvious to us, which is why we have to be diligent when we study it, because what the original hearer would have recognized is not always normal for us. Here's what you have to think about. In Palestine, modern-day Israel, in ancient Palestine, in the Old Testament, more often called Israel and Judah, it is a rocky, hilly, sort of uneven ground part of the world. I mean, there's no Kansas flatland there. I mean, when you find good farming land, it's because the rocks have all been dug up and removed, okay? In the ancient world, the idea of announcing that a king was coming for a visit, when ancient kings would plan their tours, if you will, their trips around their kingdom to put their majesty, their magnificence on display, what they would do is they would send out heralds, sometimes up to 2 years in advance of the king's arrival. Why? Because if you lived in some little village somewhere in the mountains and the herald came and said, hey, on this date, the king is coming. Well, here's what that meant. It meant that you had this much time from the announcement to the king's actual arrival to make a smooth road. That means you got rid of the rocks, you leveled the road. See, the king was going to come on a chariot. I mean, not a chariot, on some sort of wagon. And you didn't want the king arriving in your town in a bad mood because of the bumpy ride that he just had to get there. That was never a good thing. So the idea in the Old Testament was, the king is coming. Okay, we got to make straight the path. In fact, the prophets even used that language. Make straight the path. Okay, take that sort of cultural awareness and put it behind verse 12 of chapter 4. He says, when you walk, your steps will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. What's he suggesting here? What he's suggesting here is that if you diligently pursue the way of wisdom, what you'll find out is that wisdom actually leads you on paths that have already been smoothed. You won't trip. You won't stumble. You won't crash and burn. Wisdom actually makes the way of life smoother. It's fascinating. In the New Testament, we go all the way to the little postcard right before the book of Revelation, that postcard called Jude. Remember the benediction, the last two verses of Jude, verses 24 and 25? What's it say there? Jude prays for his audience that's reading his letter, and he says, now, to the God who is able to keep you from falling. No. To the God who is able to prevent you from stumbling. Before you fall, you stumble. Stumbling comes first. God not only protects you from falling, He protects you from even stumbling. How does He do that? Because wisdom walks you down a path. You choose the path that's been cleared, that's been made plain. And so what He's suggesting here is that if you listen, my son, to my words, if you follow the way of wisdom, your steps will not be hampered. When you run, you will not stumble. Life just works out better for wise people. All right? Verse 13. Take hold of instruction and do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of evil people. Avoid it, do not pass by it, turn away from it, and pass on. Now, how many ways can you say this? He's just said, follow wisdom, and you'll have a path where you won't stumble. At the same time, don't go down the path that will always lead to a crash and burn. But he says it over and over again. Do not enter the path of the wicked. Do not proceed in the way of evil people. Avoid it. Do not pass by it. Turn away from it and pass on. Why? Because there's nothing good there. I read a letter years ago. It's in my file somewhere. I couldn't find it today, but I have it somewhere. A letter that was written to a Christian magazine. And it was a young man who had gone to prison for a variety of things that he had done. And he met Jesus while he was in prison. Came to faith. Discipled while he was there. Now he's out of prison. Just gotten out. And he writes this letter to this magazine. And I always remember it because he said, I look back on my life and I realized that every time I ever got into trouble, I was off the main street. I was in an alley. I was in a dark parking lot somewhere. I was off the main street. No street lights. I was in the dark. Every time I ever got into trouble, I was someplace I shouldn't have been. Now here's a display of wisdom. Because this is a young man whose life landed him in prison. But he meets Jesus. He begins to assimilate knowledge. That is, he has facts. Now the Spirit in him teaches him how to organize those facts so that he has understanding. He can make sense of them. And now he has what's necessary to make choices that are wise because he has wisdom. And he said in that letter, I have pledged to stay off the side streets and the back alleys and keep to the main streets as I travel through the rest of my life. That's what is being said here. The choice of wisdom is to stay on the path that's been laid out for us and to avoid those side streets and dark alleys because there's nothing there but temptation and wickedness. Who's in those streets? Well, it's this evil man that we saw in chapter 2. Verse 16 describes them. In fact, let's go back before we read chapter 4, verse 16. Go back and read chapter 2, verse 13. Remember, he said in verse 12, it says, to rescue you from the way of evil, from a person who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Now we come back over to chapter 4, and we find our way back to verse 16. And in speaking about those same people, here's a summary. It says, for they cannot sleep unless they do evil, and they are robbed of sleep unless they make someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. What a powerful explanation here. The Spirit is giving wisdom through Solomon to his son, saying the people that you find in those places, they literally can't find sleep until they've done something bad. Evil is a drug. They have to have a hit before they can rest and go to sleep. Stay away. Verse 18. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. Here's the thing. Both physically and spiritually, human beings are not nocturnal creatures. We're not comfortable in the dark. We physically can't see well like nocturnal animals. We know that it's easier to fall, to stumble, to trip when we're trying to make our way in the dark. But there's also a spiritual aspect to this. Spiritual darkness is not our natural home either. Oh, it is, because sin has damaged our nature, and it has become who we are. But the way of wisdom understands that we were never meant to live that way. Darkness is not for us. Don't go down those roads. Well, the chapter ends with one more paragraph. It's what I've called the intentional protection of life. Verse 20 begins the same way. My son, pay attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. For they are life to those who find them, and healing to all their body. Another great verse to memorize, verse 23. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Now let me tell you why verse 23 is so significant. Indirectly, this verse tells us to fill the empty places of our minds with good things so that our lives are shaped by them. I mean, let me give you some verses. I didn't mark these, but let me flip over and read you some verses. In Matthew chapter 12, in verses 34 and 35, these are the words of Jesus. The last part of verse 34 and then all of verse 35. He says, for the mouth speaks from that which fills the heart. The good person brings out of his good treasure good things, and the evil person brings out of his evil treasure evil things. In other words, what comes out of your mouth is an indication of what you have stored up in your heart. Well, let's look at another verse. If we go to Romans comes after Acts. Romans chapter 12. What does verse 2 say? And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. How do we pursue Christ-likeness? The first battlefield of Christ-likeness is the renewing of our mind. We actually have to be transformed in the way we think about things. All right, let's go to one more. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, Paul says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, think about these things. As for the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. You see, whether it's the Old Testament book of Proverbs or throughout the New Testament, a basic principle of wisdom is garbage in, garbage out. Godliness in, godliness out. Verse 24, rid yourself of a deceitful mouth and keep devious speech far from you. Now that phrase is interesting, devious speech. Listen, there's only one thing worse than lying, and that is lying with such a smooth twist that you try and sell it as something good. I mean, it's one thing to just tell a lie. It's another thing to tell a lie in a way that you design other people to think that it's good. We live in a culture where good is called evil and evil is called good every single day. What is the way of wisdom? The way of wisdom is to keep devious or tricking speech out of our mouths. Don't say things. This will show my age, but we go all the way back to a president that was asked a direct question one time, and he said, well, it depends on what the definition of is. When you start parsing the definition of words, you're lying. I'm sorry, but when you say something like this, when somebody asks you a question and you start with this phrase, well, technically, see, the minute you say that to me, well, technically, then I know that it doesn't matter how you finish that sentence, because you're either justifying something that you know is wrong, or you're about to lie to me. Technically, it's not really bad. It's just, would you do it if your mama was sitting next to you? That's the question. Rid yourself of a deceitful mouth and keep devious speech far from you. Let your eyes look directly ahead and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Now that's an interesting verse, because what he's talking about here is the signs of devious motives. In other words, he's saying, make eye contact when people talk to you. Why? Because when you don't make eye contact, they know that you're hiding something. It's the way devious people are. It's the way liars are. They don't make eye contact because it's harder to maintain the lie with eye contact. See, he's giving practical advice here. Don't let these trickery words come out of your mouth, and don't let your nonverbal body language fail to communicate that what you're saying is true and trustworthy. The last two verses, 26 and 27. This is the summary. Chapters 2 through 4. This is the summary of that whole section. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot from evil. The goal is to have a successful life. And the route to get there is wisdom. We won't meet next week, but read ahead, because chapter 5, this is where we're going to bring wisdom home and we're going to apply it to marriage. Do not miss chapter 5. I don't care how long you've been married or how successful you feel you are, you need chapter 5. We'll be there in 2 weeks. Father, thank you so much for your word. Proverbs is redundant, and yet, Father, we're grateful because it is a redundant message that we need again and again and again. Help us to take these words into our heart, to hold them, to guard them, to clamp down on them so that they're always here. Let us memorize key verses Let your Spirit bring them to our minds as we face decisions and challenges in our day. Father, thank you for this poetic section of Scripture that has been preserved for us so that we can live in a way that is actually in line with the very way you established creation itself. Father, help us to be wise men and women. We pray in Jesus'